There's been lots of tech layoffs, big tech companies downsizing their tech talent, especially their tech talent. And that's created all sorts of stuff. It's AI is taking their jobs. And if you listened last week, I talked about some of the real threats AI can bring and how you need to be careful of that, and I'll probably touch on them briefly here. But there was an article in Inc. that talked about this, where one person kind of went off on what the real reasons are, because on the surface you hear it's AI and AI is taking over the tech jobs. And I actually agree that I think there's some truth in that AI can do coding and that, but it's not just AI. Robots are now in, and so tech companies are laying them off. Now, I'll share the four things that they outlined as the real reasons. I'll go one by one and go where I think there's some truth to that and where I think there's not. And then ultimately, what does this mean for organizations and then for employees? So the first one he said, no one understands AI, but everyone thinks they do. And what he was really getting at was, as we move into this AI boom, there can be this pressure to just hire all this talent and everybody knows exactly where it's going to go. And so they stand up these organizations, but they don't really know what they're doing. And so it doesn't quite go according to plan. And as a result, they have to wipe people out. And I think there is a lot of truth in that statement. I think there's a lot of truth in that statement that, as an example, I've seen AI companies rise and fall so much in the past, 2 year and a half, as people went, oh, this is going to be the big thing. And so they go that route, then it doesn't quite go according to plan. And they either get bought up and everybody gets kind of wiped out because the tech just gets absorbed, or it doesn't go quite as big. And so then people get ripped out. And I think there is some truth to that. So to companies, I would be cautious in how fast and how deep you go into something with the idea that, no, this is going to be the big thing. And the previous point of Ashton Kutcher going, this is where big mainstream media is. Well, if you put together a team that does nothing but how do we create consumer-based prompting for creating text media, I wouldn't necessarily throw all your eggs into that basket. But this goes back to the innovation cycle and how companies should think about innovation. You don't throw your eggs all into one basket. And I think there have been some real mistakes in the tech sphere that could have been mitigated. And I think for companies, they should be mitigated. I think to employees, you need to be careful of this. Like, think through some of the things that you're getting involved with. And if your company wants to throw you onto a project that feels a little like, it looks exciting, but like, is that really viable? Just make sure you've got a backup plan to help prepare yourself or keep your relationships going. So again, I think there's truth to it. This one, I think, may be one of the strongest ones. It talks about investors and boards flew too close to the sun, which is really getting at this. They got too big, too fast. They, really kind of like charged into things, and the economy was uncertain. And so there was a lot of money thrown into it, and there was free cash flow, and then things didn't quite land. I think there is, again, truth to that. And I think this one is tied to the first one. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of stuff. Money was free flowing. The economy didn't quite turn out. People didn't quite know where things went. Some of this is just the nature of doing business. And I think this just goes back to good risk mitigation strategies, both for companies and employees. So again, I think there's some truth to this one. And it's not just as simple as AI got rid of all these people. The one that I thought was interesting, I thought they were interesting. It talked about the fact that tech talent got entitled. And I think there is a lot of truth in this. I don't necessarily point the finger at the I think there's mutual responsibility here. So if you look at what happened with tech talent, and if you've been following workforce trends at all, there's similar things that have happened in others, and I'll connect the dots here. But there has been this just boom around tech, and it was this very niche area that not a lot of people knew about, and you couldn't really explain what these people did, especially to some of your business leaders who were making decisions about it. And so people started going, well, we got to get the best and we got to do this and we got to have these people around and all these things. And so people just started requiring ridiculous amounts of money to pay for tech talent. And as a result, you start offering people ridiculous salaries and ridiculous perks and all this stuff. People start to come to expect that. And I do think that the value of tech talent got overinflated. It absolutely did. Is that the company's fault? Is that the tech talent fault? I think there's some mutual responsibility in that. And I think the wisdom in this is you've got to be really careful about this. One, if you're a company, because it's not sustainable. So if you got to look at market trends, and you don't always necessarily even have to look at market trends and go, well, if everybody else is paying their tech talent this, then we have to too. That's what ends up fueling this cycle. But you got to recognize, well, then we might not get the best tech talent, which to me just says this is why you have to have robust development strategies for your talent. So you don't have to go hire the New York Yankees to be your talent. You can go, look, we'll start from the ground and build the talent. And when they get to a point where they need to make more, we'll let them move on, or we'll figure it out at that point. So I think there's some real strategy that companies can take. I think the caution to employees is you got to be really careful, because this isn't just tech talent. I saw this happen at mass when the pandemic hit. And a good example of this was recruiting talent. There was such a shortage of talent. Recruiters became like diamonds to companies. A good recruiter, you didn't even have to be a good recruiter, and you could go command an insane salary for this. And I remember talking to a lot of people I knew who were recruiters when it was the heyday, and it's like, hey, I just got an offer to make 200K to go be a, and frontline recruiter at this company. And I was like, that's not going to be sustainable, and be careful, because you're going to set your lifestyle up, and that's not going to hold, because the skill required, at least for that frontline stuff, it's not a $200,000 a year job. And sure enough, things reset. And I think what can happen is we got to be careful, because things like this, if you're an employee, you really have to be objective about the value you add to a company, and how unique is your talent set, how unique are your skills. And if a basic job suddenly, because of a certain thing in the economy or where the world is, blows up, hey, if you can ride the wave, good for you. But just know at some point that wave's going to crest. And when it does, it's going to come crashing down. And so just make sure you've built your life around the floor, not the ceiling. And I think that's one of the things. But I think there's truth to this. I think there is truth to this, that the tech companies went, well, we went way all in on this tech. We got carried away with what we were paying. And now AI has the wave crested, and we're back to where it probably should have been in the first place. And that's a risk that everybody faces. The other thing it talked about was the wrong people are in charge. And I think there's some truth to that. I think some of the way that the tech trajectory was positioned, and the stories that were being told, and kind of the egos that got inflated, and then it was like, oh no, what do we do? And we're not going to take responsibility for this, so let's just wipe out the people. And that's the part that really bothers me, is when this kind of stuff happens, usually it's the vulnerable. And I don't mean vulnerable like, oh, these poor tech talent, they couldn't have done anything. No, but like, when it comes to the totem pole, they were the easiest people to just boom, sideswipe. And instead of holding the people accountable, going, wait, who is the one who made the decision to build these teams? Who's the one who decided to set salaries at this rate? Who's the one who decided to grow this team that ultimately added no value because it was chasing something that there was no business case even put out? That is unfortunate, because oftentimes where it'll get thumped is the people who were just doing their job, showing up, trying to just do what they were told, and then it all falls apart, and they're the ones who take the heat. And the one person either goes and starts with another company, or they just get their job position moved. So I think there's some truth in all of these. And I think this is also why, as employees, you got to be really careful, because some of this stuff can happen. It can happen to anybody. It happened to tech talent now. It can happen to anybody. And with the advance of AI, it's a real risk. If you listen to last week's, the whole 60 team writer team that got wiped out by AI. So everybody is vulnerable to this. There's one thing though that I think was completely left out of this article, which is AI is extremely, extremely expensive. And there's this perception that AI is cheap and free and, hey, you can use GPT 4.0 for free, and even if you need the paid, it's only 20 bucks a month. It's not all that expensive. But what a lot of us aren't seeing is how much money these tech companies are pouring into building this. It's extremely expensive to build. It is extremely expensive to build. And so they're pouring tons and tons, trillions of dollars, thousands of employees into building this. And then it gets to a point where it's like, okay, we're there and we've spent all this money. And now what do? We got to balance the scales. And I think we're seeing some of the right sizing happening in the tech industry right now. And I just don't know that it's avoidable, but it is interesting to watch this use case and say, hey, to anybody out there, regardless of what field or industry you're in, these are the kinds of things you need to be watching for and paying attention to, because if you don't, you are going to get blindsided and this will sneak up on you and you'll think, no, I couldn't possibly be touched. I'm, impenetrable, and what I do is so important, and all the best decisions were made, and this organization is, sound. And then out of left field, things can change on a dime.